Good afternoon, all. Welcome to the Terwilliger Place Grand Opening and Policy Forum. This is the Policy Forum. The grand opening ribbon cutting will be after this, so you get a preview of my remarks, which unfortunately will be a little repetitive there. But my name is Matt Birenbaum. I'm happy to kick things off here today in my role as chairman of the APAH board. Just a tiny little bit about me. I've been active in the housing industry for 30 plus years. And in my day job, I serve as the Chief Investment Officer at Avalon Bay Communities, which is also headquartered here in Arlington, and which is one of the many spin-offs that came out of Ron's original entity of Trammell Residential many years ago. In fact, there's almost nobody in the multifamily business today who's more than 2 degrees of separation removed from Ron. So we're really honored to have truly one of the legends of the industry with us here today, and we'll hear from him shortly. Today we're here both to celebrate this innovative and groundbreaking project and also to reflect on its lessons for affordable housing policy here in Arlington, the region, and the country. The site where we're gathered here today has for a long time been the home of American Legion Post number 139. You can see how beautiful it was back in the day. And this facility served local veterans for nearly a century as a gathering place for social support, community service, and integration with civilian life. By the mid-2010s, the facility, which was built in the 1950s, had aged to the point that it was in urgent need of costly repairs. Rather than just rebuild a new standalone facility, the leadership of the Post had the vision to imagine putting their land to a broader use for local veterans and the community at large, and selected APAH to redevelop the site to build new affordable housing co-located with a new Post headquarters on the ground floor. In an infill community like Arlington, where land is scarce and opportunities for affordable housing production are few and far between, this is a great example of the larger opportunity for land-rich nonprofits with capital needs to build critically needed housing and further their missions at the same time. At APAH, we've spoken with a number of local churches as well, which is another example that we've been able to leverage in the same way. This kind of innovation can't happen without the support of the local community. And Arlington County has been a critical partner through the process, working with neighboring property owners through a 3-year process to develop a plan for the area that would accommodate denser multifamily development with a transit-oriented vision. And you can see another piece of that vision literally 2 buildings away, where Mill Creek Residential, another progenitor of TCR, the other way around, I guess, is their building market rate community, which will open, it looks like, about a year from now. But when you look at the whole super block together, it's a great example of mixed income in a really high opportunity area by the Metro, the Giant across the street, great schools, all the other things that make this such an exceptional location. But in addition to supportive land partners and accommodative zoning, building this type of deeply affordable housing also requires money, lots of it, from all levels of government, including federal low-income housing tax credits, Virginia housing taxable and tax-exempt bonds, Arlington County affordable housing investment funds, and in this particular project, also private philanthropic contributions to fund brick and mortar, most notably from Ron Terwilliger, who we will hear from shortly. This was the first time that APAH has used private donations to fund new affordable housing, and for us, it was a bit of a risk. When we first started working on the site, we considered several program options, including some that would have included $1 million townhomes or high-end market apartments on portions of the property. However, in the end, we thought the site was just too good not to optimize the amount of affordable housing we could provide to further our mission, and we decided to go big instead. Private fundraising made that possible. This funding helps create 160 new homes where we're all sitting today, all at below market rents, and including 26 new homes for households with incomes at 30% AMI, and 64 homes for households at 50% AMI. In addition, 16 of the homes have been designated as permanent supportive housing, and 50% will have a preference for veterans in keeping with the mission of the Legion. And I just stopped in at the leasing office here just before this event, and they've already, of the apartments currently leased, 33% have gone to veterans so far, and they've got a number of VASH vouchers to further that. Today, we'll hear from a number of experts about ways in which we can all continue to work together to replicate this tremendous success and how we can apply some of the learnings of this project to continue to advance the cause of affordable housing. First, we'll hear from Ron Terwilliger about his thoughts on the housing affordability crisis today. Then we'll hear from a panel on land use and affordable housing in high opportunity areas. And third will be a panel on state and local financing tools. At the end of each panel, there should be a few minutes for Q&A. So let's get started. First up, we have Ron Terwilliger, who will be interviewed by APAH CEO Carmen Romero. As I mentioned, Ron is a legend. He's the former CEO and chairman emeritus of Trammell Crow Residential, the largest apartment developer in the U.S. really for decades during his tenure as CEO. Ron is an honor graduate of the United States Naval Academy. After serving 5 years in the Navy, he received his MBA with high distinction from Harvard Business School, where he was elected a Baker Scholar. He's incredibly involved in the industry and the community. He's past chairman of ULI. Currently, he's a trustee there. He's also chairman emeritus of the Wharton Real Estate Center, past chairman of the International Board of Directors of Habitat for Humanity, currently serves as Habitat's chair of Global Development Council. He's the chairman of Enterprise Community Partners Board of Trustees, chairman of the board of the U.S. Naval Academy Foundation, and is a member of the boards of the I Have a Dream Foundation and the Bipartisan Policy Center, where he chairs the J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. I don't know about you, Ron, but when I retire, I want to be involved, but I don't know if I want to work that hard. Ron was inducted into the NAHB Hall of Fame in 2008. 2009, he was honored by the National Housing Conference with the Housing Leader of the Year Award. He was the recipient of the 23 ULI J.C. Nichols Prize for Visionaries in Urban Development, the 2017 Edward W. Brooke Housing Leadership Award for his outstanding contributions to elevating the national discussion on federal housing policy. And in addition to generating so generously of his time and talent, Ron is also one of the leading housing philanthropists in the nation. Among his many generous gifts is a $1.5 million donation to build this groundbreaking new community, which is named in honor of his parents, Lucille and Bruce Terwilliger. Carmen Romero has been president and CEO at APAH since July 2021. She joined APAH in 2011 and spent the last decade overseeing the real estate team, contributing to the creation or preservation of over 1,200 new affordable housing units in the DC region, with an additional 1,000 homes in development in Arlington, Fairfax, Loudoun counties in Northern Virginia, as well as Montgomery County in Maryland and the District of Columbia. Under Carmen's leadership, APAH's real estate development team has delivered innovative, award-winning affordable housing properties, including Queens Court in West Roslyn, Gilliam Place down on Columbia Pike, Columbia Hills, and the Springs. Prior to joining APAH in 2011, she was a director of real estate development and public-private partnerships at Clark Construction, and she began her career at Marriott International. Carmen holds an MBA in finance from the Wharton School and a BS in foreign service from Georgetown. Carmen lives with her husband and 3 kids here in Arlington and volunteers her time for other nonprofit boards, including the Columbia Pike Partnership, Tyson's Partnership, and Housing Partnership Network. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carmen, who's going to interview Ron.
Thank you, Matt. Well, it's my great pleasure to take some time with some of our closest partners and let you get to know Ron a little bit better. And I'm going to first off start by publicly thanking Ron for his support of APAH, his support of this vision for Terwilliger Place, and really what he's done for the industry of affordable housing. Oh, okay. Sorry, I guess they're taping us wrong. Sorry. We were going to do this casually, but this is... Okay. Is this on? Okay, it's on. Well, let me start off by reading what Matt was saying, which is Terwilliger Place represents affordable housing in an area of opportunity. Walking distance to 2 metro stations with access to jobs, fantastic public schools, across the street from George Mason University, the fastest growing university in the state of Virginia. It is truly, to me, what we as APAH really strive for is this is where affordable housing belongs. Ron, what are you most proud of today?
Well, let me first thank you for the opportunity for us to name this property after our parents. My brother Bruce is in the front row here with us. He and I grew up in Arlington in the 40s and 50s. Things were pretty affordable then. I think our father bought our house in 1941 for $5,000 and may have sold it 30 years later for $750,000 without doing anything to it. But I've become aware over the years is how expensive it is to live here. We just, Dennis and I just finished a 3.5-hour session with the Bipartisan Policy Center and speaking about neighborhoods of opportunity. This is about as good as it gets for affordable housing. I mean, this is really incredible. My former partners are building, I guess right there, a 100% market rate housing project. So enabling people of lower incomes to live in neighborhoods of opportunity where their kids can get decent educations, where they can get access to food and jobs and be safe is really rare these days. Sadly, the NIMBYism is rampant in our country, and while most Americans would not admit they don't want low-income people to have housing, they clearly don't want them living close to them, and therefore it's a really big struggle for people to be able to place housing with rent restrictions, affordable housing. This is a magnificent. Bruce and I are both veterans. We're both Naval Academy grads. So this being set aside for veterans is especially poignant for us.
Thank you, Ron. Well, next I want to touch a little bit on the affordable housing crisis. The pandemic has made this even harder with rents going up, I think on average in 2021, 17% in the nation. And in the DC area, 5 to 17, 15% in the last year alone. Arlington has the highest median rent in the DMV. You talk to policymakers all the time in your work and in your groups at ULI Terwilliger Center and the Bipartisan Center. Do you feel that folks are coming together to come up with solutions to really meet the magnitude of the need?
Well, you know, I became aware of the housing crisis in this country maybe 30 years ago. I've been on Habitat's board for more than 20. I wasn't aware of it. Megan Patnode, sitting here in the front row beside my brother, worked with me and her mom in a housing foundation where we went to Congress. You know, Pam and I decided that we would go talk to the federal government about a housing crisis. And to my surprise, maybe it shouldn't have been, very few congressmen seem to understand the order of magnitude of this housing crisis. I mean, we have 50% of our renters that are paying more than 30% of their income and a quarter paying more than 50%. Yet it didn't seem like Congress was very aware of it, so we spent a long time walking the halls of Congress trying to impress that upon them. Then you get the pandemic, and I'm a market rate apartment developer now with 3 different companies. I've never seen anything in my 42 years in the apartment business quite like what's going on in the last year and a half. First, you go into the pandemic in 2020, and we were in a recession, which turned out to be a real V-shaped recession, but we didn't know what was going to come. Rents were probably flat. And then all of a sudden, the big winner, from an investment standpoint, the big winners for the pandemic were multifamily and industrial. People poured money in, and as Carmen commented, rents went up in 2021 in the Southeast, where most of my development is, went up 20%. I think in Miami they went up 40%. In Austin, I heard they went up 40%. I don't see how people can deal with that. And they have kept going up in 2022, although it started to moderate. At the same time, construction costs started escalating. So construction costs, I think you probably got this contracted in before that happened. Just in time. But construction costs went up 50% in 18 months. So projects that we used to build for $140,000 a unit construction cost are now $240,000 a unit. So the combination of those two has just made the lack of affordability in this country worse than it's ever been. Dennis and I were spending time this morning with our advisory board, which is a couple of former HUD secretaries, Fannie Mae chairman, and Renee Glover, people know who she is, experts in housing, trying to figure out what legislation we can introduce at the federal level. We know work needs to be done at the local and state level. I co-chair Habitat's advocacy campaign in the U.S., and we're working through our 1,200 affiliates to try to help impress upon people at the local and state level that there's a tremendous problem, that they can be a part of the solution, whether it's allowing accessory dwelling units. There's a number of things that can be done to help. But we're focusing, Dennis and I and the Bipartisan Policy Center, primarily now on what kind of legislation we can introduce. Because as many of you may know, the Build Back Better bill that did not happen in the Democratic Congress had $260 billion for housing in it. You know, this government has not supported housing to that degree in a long, long time. That's not happening, so we're now trying to come back in what is, in my mind, a nonpartisan issue, housing, with a bipartisan approach. And we have some Republican champions, and we got to put together some legislation and hopefully get something done in the new Congress, whatever it looks like.
You touched on some of the supply chain problems and the issues really building any project, especially something of this magnitude today. We also have the problem of NIMBYism, which you touched on. And I think, candidly, you know, I really have to give kudos to Mark Schwartz, our county manager. Sorry, Mark, I have to put you in the spotlight where you're not often forced to be. And Christian Dorsey, an elected official who's here with us, I saw him walk in and Avenetia. I think Arlington County does an amazing job with their leadership in terms of reimagining and using density as a tool to have affordable housing like this be possible. How do we get more localities and more states to do what Arlington is doing here?
Yeah, it's been a long challenge for me and others who are advocates in the industry. I do believe education is a part of it. As I commented when Pam and I went to Congress, some of the U.S. senators I met with just seemed to have no idea of how much suffering people were doing. I think education and then just grassroots, it's worse than it's ever been. Most of the mayors know about it now, the chairman of the city councils. We're trying as best we can through the different organizations. Christopher Tomey's here today. He works with me in the ULI Housing Center. We're trying to do panels in local district councils to show what best practices are, what can be done. So I think we got to get our citizenry aware of the problems, motivated to think they should do something about it. I mean, housing is a fundamental human need. I think it's a fundamental human right. And we don't fund it. If we didn't need subsidy, you know, everybody would be making enough money to afford market rate housing. We're far from that, and we're moving away from it. So I think, Carmen, we have to educate people as to the order of magnitude of the problem, convince them to the extent we need to that it's really important that we house our citizens, that they have a safe place, their kids can study, they can. Economic mobility, I think, is largely going to be dependent on these kids getting a better education. They can't do that in these areas that they're forced to live in where their schools are failing. And then we're going to have to figure out how to fund it, and that can come from a wide range of areas. We were talking this morning about how we get the private sector, which I am engaged in building market rate apartments, how we get the private sector re-engaged in building mixed income housing. You know, the low-income housing tax credit's the biggest production thing we have in the country, but it's not nearly enough, and a lot of it's now being built by nonprofits. And then things like what you do here, the for-profit community couldn't touch it because it's too much brain damage. There's too many subsidies. So I congratulate APAH and Arlington County. I mean, it's wonderful for Bruce and I growing up here to see how, obviously proximity to DC, to see how expensive it's gotten and how hard you all are working to try to give decent housing to some of your citizens, because this is a marvelous example of what can be done if people put their mind to it.
Thank you. And I also think something that I've heard you talk in support of is the need for more housing vouchers, because no matter how much we build, that is also an important tool. Can you tell folks a little bit about your work on that funding source?
Yeah, no, thanks. For Dennis and I, we've kind of framed the issue at the Bipartisan Policy Center Housing Policy Group that just met as we have to add to the supply. And that's what, you know, we're talking about. We have to build more, but that requires subsidy. And my view is we're never going to build our way out of it, but we ought to try. We ought to find creative ways to build more, including accessory dwelling units and things that secondly, we should preserve what we got. I still don't understand why LIHTC has an expiration date on their rent restrictions. I don't know why they did that to start with, and I'm hoping that that will be eliminated so we can preserve what we've got. But thirdly, the way we could, at the numbers, at scale, really touch this is by having a voucher program that would supplement the incomes of people who can't afford market rate. But you know, today, there's only somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 people who are eligible for vouchers who get awarded them because it's an annual allocation from Congress. So, you know, the tax credits program is permanent now, thankfully, but the voucher program is allocated every year. And then we had a couple of HUD secretaries, Sean Donovan recently, talking this morning about how in some parts of the country you can't even use the vouchers because landlords won't take them. So one of the things Dennis and I and our group are going to try and figure out, probably by convening a bunch of landlords, is what we can do to reform the voucher program so that they will not only take them, maybe they'll desire them, but the opportunity to get people into neighborhoods like this with vouchers, landlords don't have a motivation to take them. They have to have the government inspect their properties. There's just a lot of headaches involved with the voucher program. So landlords won't take them, and that defeats the purpose. So I'm hoping we'll find a way to reform that.
So would you say, what are your highest priorities now at the Bipartisan Center or other groups that you're affiliated with in terms of where we are today in 2022 and the housing affordability crisis?
Well, I think the crisis, as I said, because the pandemic has gotten worse, because of construction cost increases, because of rent increases. So I believe what we need to do is to try to impress upon the federal government that there's a real need to have some reforms to add to the supply, to add to the demand side, the voucher side, to do the reforms necessary. And it's going to require all the housing organizations in this country, like APAH, I think, to educate the citizenry as to the problem and as to the need to do something about it. Because, you know, unless you know some family, I mean, there's 580,000 homeless on the streets every night in this country. And when you talk about veterans, you kind of get people's attention. And there's some VASH vouchers, I think, that really help with that. But it's a gigantic program, and it's a shame in the greatest country in the history of the world, as rich a country as we have, that we have so many of our citizens that can't afford decent housing in a decent location.
Thank you, Ron. Well, we're going to get a chance to hear from some other folks who are in the work with us, but I'm so glad they had an opportunity to hear directly from you, really all the areas that you're trying to move forward with through the Bipartisan Center and the ULI Terwilliger Center to help us. And thank you again for your support and for being here. And Bruce, for letting us honor your parents.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rich Jordan, and I serve as the vice chair for the board of APAH. With me today, we've got a distinguished panel of guests, and I'd like to invite them to come up now, assuming they're all here. Yes, please. And I apologize that I'm standing. I thought we've got 5 people, so I'm going to stand while you guys answer the question, so I hope you don't feel like I'm talking down to you here. So today's panel will focus on local land use and affordable housing in high opportunity areas. I don't have full bios, but I'm going to just take a second and ask each of our panelists to just introduce themselves just briefly, and then we'll get into the topics today. So Christian, we'll start with you.
Will do. I'm Christian Dorsey. I'm vice chair of the Arlington County Board. I've been on the board since 2016, and happy to be here and see you all today. Thanks.
And I'm Chuck Bean, Executive Director of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. Perhaps more importantly, I'm an Arlingtonian, and my daughter went to Wakefield and Wharton.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laura Searfoss. I'm Senior Program Director in Enterprise Community Partners Mid-Atlantic Office, and I lead our efforts for transit-oriented development along Montgomery County and Prince George's County's Purple Line.
And my name is Dennis Shea. I'm that dentist that was mentioned in the previous discussion. I'm the executive director of the J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy at the BPC. I'm a relatively recent resident of Arlington. We moved here 2 years ago and love living in the Ballston section of the city. And my daughter's a proud graduate of Washington Liberty High School.
Great. Well, thank you all for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. I guess just a quick background on myself. My day job, I work in commercial real estate development, and I'm also a veteran, Naval Academy graduate, a couple of years after you, Ron, but happy to be there. So as many of you know, affordable housing is critical, not as it only provides housing security to its residents, but it's also important for the overall economic growth and prosperity of the community. I firmly believe that communities that really make a deliberate effort to provide affordable housing are better off for it. However, restrictive land use regulations can reduce and delay housing from being built, which in turn creates a supply-demand imbalance, resulting in higher home prices, increased competition for existing housing stock, both on the rental and for sale side, which in turn creates increased rent burdens and risk of housing instability for many. As we talked about today, 50% of Americans are paying over 30% of their income on housing, which is really not a sustainable model. So today's topics, we've got 4 different topics. And the first one is TOD, or transit-oriented development, and reducing exclusionary zoning. So Christian, first question is going to go to you. Arlington has a great history of TOD development, which is evident by, for those familiar, is the RBC corridor has a tremendous amount of development that's occurred over the last 30, 40 years along transit sites. So can you give us some background on development in Arlington, why TOD is important, and talk about how we ended up with Terwilliger Place today?
Well, thanks, Rich, and thanks for on behalf of Arlington, thanks for the compliment, and Carmen for your kind words earlier. It's no secret that for the last 5 decades, the paradigm for Arlington was to leverage Metro and to ensure that we accommodated future growth by centering on what has been termed smart growth development. It has certainly worked for us. The results are really in the numbers. We have roughly 60% of Arlington's households reside on roughly 20% of our land in our major corridors centered by the Roslyn-Ballston, the Richmond Highway, and the Columbia Pike corridors. It's a tremendous success story in efficiency, but not just because it upholds smart growth principles. Think about what this means for the community. We've been able to accommodate a substantial amount of growth, not necessarily annually, but collectively over the last several generations in a way that has been extremely efficient, which has also just created some really interesting and unique outcomes that I think we're proud of here in Arlington. First of which, we've got these amazing places that have been built around transit stations. We've leveraged that massive investment to actually create neighborhoods, wholly contained neighborhoods, not only where people live, but also where most of our jobs are centered. We have the other amenities that define communities. And what this means on a day-to-day basis is that people are able to, if they choose to, live their life without a personal vehicle, which is amazing. And even if they do have a personal vehicle, the number of vehicular trips that they take are substantially reduced compared to all others. So through this smart growth thing, we're talking about building community, accommodating future growth, more environmental sustainability. And this is something that is necessary for any thriving, dynamic community to be able to do moving forward. But it's also something that very much is advantageous for business growth. Because within each of these places that have accommodated Arlington's growth and where our population lives, we also have co-located at the same time a tremendous amount of our business sector, which is able to sort of be a part of an ecosystem of other businesses that help them grow and thrive. So we think that this has been a great thing, not just for planning, even though that's important, but the real life outcomes are what I'm uniquely proud of. And what we're getting better at as we look at, sort of smart growth 2.0, 3.0, whatever you want to call it, is how to make sure we're leveraging all of this so that it just doesn't benefit the privileged among us or those with the most power, but that we recognize that the value that's created can actually produce affordable housing. As we're thinking about, Arlington over the last And Ann, you probably know the numbers better than I do, but we had the highest year-over-year increase in our affordable housing inventory from 21 to 22 or 20 to 21, I can't remember which. But even more importantly, over the last 5 years, Arlington has basically increased its committed affordable housing capacity by 45%. Tremendous rate of growth in the last 5 years. So none of this would have been possible without the transit-oriented development that has been really our principle for the last 5 decades.
That's great. Thank you for that answer. So Chuck, next question comes towards you. So your organization, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, published a report, I believe in 2015, but has a period from 2019 to 2030 where there is a additional projected housing of like 320,000 units. So that's 29,000 units per year. When you go back and look at the data, I look at 2019, I think there was roughly 3,300 units produced. 2020, pandemic, about 2,000 units produced, so well below some of those aspirational levels. So the question to you is this: how important is zoning reform towards meeting this goal, and how important is it to providing the supply in TOD areas?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to start with the bad news, which is the big challenge and the scale of what we're up against, then try to end with the good news, which is talking about this example here. In the big scale of things, we got to remember we're the 6th largest metropolitan area in the country, and every decade since the 40s and 50s, in the 40s, we grew by 60%, and every decade except for one, we grew by about 600,000 people. Now, what caused the growth was this vibrant economy, and I think the policy objective is finding a place for everyone in this economy. So housing epitomizes that place. So that is behind some of these big numbers. Our organization, in part, is kind of the umpire, projecting jobs, housing, population, balls and strikes, but we also see the number of housing units that are needed. So while we project 245,000 units will be built this decade, what's really needed is 320,000 units. If we don't build those units, we have transportation problems. So one of the best ways to improve transportation congestion is to build more units closer to jobs, closer to housing. Now, this is a high opportunity area. It's close to Virginia Square. And we've modeled all the high capacity transit station areas in the region. And they occupy just 10% of the region's land mass, just 10%. But they account for 55% of the region's job growth. It's like an acupuncture chart of opportunity around these transit nodes. And I think the idea of development coming out of the mid-20th century, live here, work there, got replaced by mixed use, got replaced by transit-oriented development. So I think the next evolution from my perspective is transit-oriented communities. Mixed use, absolutely, but also mixed income, mixed use and mixed income proximate to transit. So folks can get to that great FDIC job a block away. But as we think about who are our frontline people before pandemic, police, firefighters, absolutely. But man, I was grateful that those grocery store workers were there during the pandemic at the Giant across the street. So mixed use, mixed income. The challenge is, my estimate is we need 351 of these in the next decade. Carmen, this is big lift, yeah? But in the scale of our metropolitan region, to improve transportation, to improve quality of life, and have better climate, we need 351 of these. But we got Fairfax, Montgomery, Prince George's, all bigger than half dozen states. So we have the capacity, and if we can get that private public sector moving more, when we did these targets in 2019, it would have been science fiction that there would be an investor of $800 million in these kind of housing affordability, not just production, but in the right place. Mm-hmm. And David from Amazon is going to talk about that. So it seemed like science fiction. Now it's possible. So we're looking forward to achieving these very hard things in the next few years.
That's great. Thank you for that. That's very helpful. So Laura, next question goes to you. So what are some other zoning reform or TOD efforts around the region that you see or view as best practice?
Yeah, so I'll start with one close to home along the Purple Line. The Purple Line Corridor Coalition has been working to really build involvement across all sectors, so public, private, and philanthropic. And one of the things we're most proudest of is our capital pool, which was seeded with a $5 million investment from JP Morgan Chase and matched by Kaiser Permanente. and a few other investors. And that's been able to act as a magnet to the corridor, be able to leverage the investments that Montgomery County and Prince George's County is making in their housing investment funds, to be able to attract more development to the corridor. So we're excited to see about 500 units be realized so far, and what that can continue to do as we raise more money and it continues to revolve. So that's one thing that's happening close to home. In my experience working across the country on TOD efforts, one thing I found really impactful is when the state is supportive of seeing more transit-oriented development. And a great example of this I came across when I was doing work in the Seattle region. Washington State has a great, they call it their growth management framework. It comes from the state and encourages local communities across Washington State to set areas where they want to see urban growth occur, and then they come alongside and offer essentially a multifamily tax abatement, or they call it an exemption, in those areas for both market rate multifamily, if you get a shorter exemption if you do that, and then a longer one, and as well as they just added in 2021 one for affordable home ownership opportunities. And I've seen places like Tacoma, Washington, use this to increase affordability in areas of high opportunity. So they do not offer the 8-year one for market rate multifamily in those areas. They only offer the ones for affordable housing. And that's another way I think we can bring kind of all the tools we have across all sectors to bear.
So I'm going to go off topic just a little bit. We touched on this last time. So we talked about naturally occurring affordable housing. It seems like a simple solution, but it's a little more complicated than just that. Maybe just talk about that briefly.
Yes. So I think as many of you who are familiar with the region know, a lot of the affordable housing serving households, particularly along the Purple Line, is unrestricted housing. So it doesn't have any rent restrictions. And in some cases it's affordable, but I'll also say particularly we're learning more and more it's less and less affordable. Households are doubling, tripling up to be able to live there affordably. So we've seen tools like the right of first refusal in Prince George's County and some housing funds in Montgomery County that kind of provide this interim financing to essentially transfer those properties quickly to mission-driven developers. But at the same time, we know that there's limits on those, particularly as they're being redeveloped. Households without legal status can't always benefit from that redevelopment. So we have some big challenges as we think about how to make sure everyone can stay in those, especially as we use the tools we have to keep them affordable and improve their quality.
Awesome, thank you. So Dennis, jumping over to you. So the housing supply problem is not just a regional one, but clearly a national one. So what reforms are you seeing at the national level that you've seen to be effective?
Well, thank you for this opportunity. It's been a real pleasure getting to know and work with Ron. And we talk a lot about housing policy, but this is housing practice. This is an amazing facility that shows that affordable housing can be very beautiful housing. So it's really a pleasure to be here. But yeah, we have as Ron has pointed out many times, we have a housing affordability crisis that's national. It has multiple dimensions. One dimension is that household incomes have not kept up with housing costs. But a big part of the problem, which we've been focusing on in our first year of existence at the Terwilliger Center, is the lack of supply, the supply dimension. We have simply underbuilt housing by millions of homes over the past 15 years. There are various estimates. Freddie Mac says it's a $3.8 million deficit. The realtors put out an estimate of $5.5 million. And it affects all types of housing, not just single-family housing, but duplexes, multifamily housing. We just have underbuilt housing over the past 15 years since the Great Recession. We just have not yet fully recovered from the Great Recession, where supply has not met the demand out there as a result of new household formations. And so what we're focusing is on supply. There's some great ideas in Congress. Ron mentioned the legislation that we're working on, bipartisan legislation. A key aspect of the supply problem, attacking that would be strengthening the low-income housing tax credit. We have Bobby Rozen in the audience, who is one of the architects of the housing credit. So there's legislation bipartisan to strengthen that and to provide more resources for that. There's something called the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which is another tool to encourage private investment in the rehabilitation and construction of homes for sale in distressed communities. Therefore, affordable for up to, I think, 120 area median income would be the household level. So that's another thing that has bipartisan support, and we're trying to push that. And of course, one of the biggest reasons for the lack of supply is local land use restrictions, which limit the diversity of housing that can be done. And we're highlighting communities throughout the country who have taken this on, cities like Minneapolis, which has eliminated single-family zoning and eliminated off-street parking requirements. It's a blue community. But then you have red states like Utah, which have statewide legalized accessory dwelling units, which can be an important source of affordable housing. So we're trying to show that there are people on both sides, all political persuasions, who recognize that we have a housing affordability crisis and we need to have more supply. Of course, one of the things we would support would be a federal grant program that would competitive, that would give communities incentives to develop plans that allow for greater diversity of housing. We think there should be, we support the Yes in My Backyard Act, which requires transparency among CDBG grantees to show what they're doing to promote greater housing diversity and more supply. So there's a lot of tools out there. We like to say it's not a federal issue only, it's a national issue, which will require action at the federal level, the state level, the local level, the corporate level, the nonprofit level, all levels, because there's so many things that need to be done to overcome where we are. But thank you.
Yeah, so just to kind of touch on that point for a second, the NIMBYism, we heard that earlier from Ron was mentioning on that. That's really a big issue, right? Because you have these federal reforms that are there. You have local jurisdictions that potentially are pushing back either the residents or the politicians. How do we get past that narrative, right? How do we address and change that?
Well, you gotta keep. I think this says it. I mean, this is part of the narrative. This says that affordable housing is attractive, which is a great addition to the community. I live in Arlington. There's a lot of missing middle housing. There's a lot of diversity of how I live in a single family home, but there's also affordable housing right up the street from me. It's a vibrant community. We have to, I think one thing we need to do more is research. I think the concern from a lot of people is that putting in more affordable housing or multifamily housing affects their single-family home values. And I think we need to show more research, get more research out there that demonstrates that it doesn't. In fact, it could actually improve and enhance your value.
Yeah, that's a great response. Thank you for that. So the next topic is development review and regulation. So Christian, we're going to go back to you. So we talked about infrastructure investment as communities continue to grow, and this project is a great example of that, right? There was a significant amount of improvements as a condition approval. Those approvals take several years. A lot of times people don't understand. They see the building going up, and that's probably 2 years, but what they don't fully appreciate is it's 3, 4, 5 years of planning to get there, right? And for affordable housing projects, that can be the death, right? I always say time kills all deals, but especially true for affordable housing deals, right? There's time increments you have to deal with. So, in the examples of the improvements on Terwilliger Place, we had things like cross through street, bioretention systems, underground utilities, streetscapes, landscape, things like that. That's great stuff. So how important is it to make these improvements as Arlington continues to grow?
Well, essential, and I want to pick up where Dennis left off. Part of what many people have in their hearts and minds are vestiges of when the federal government was involved in national housing policy and urban renewal and housing projects and the stereotypical Cabrini Green. And so they hear affordable housing project, and that's their image, and that's their thing. But this should be their thing, because this is what we do now. And one of the ways in which this brings value, not just to people who are able to live here, whose incomes may be constrained, but for all of the infrastructure improvements as part of the development process approval that shows that this is adding value to the entire community. This is making us more resilient to stormwater change. This project is helping to increase connectivity throughout the neighborhoods, which are going to make it not only easier to navigate, but also reduce congestion, which is obviously something that's an existential challenge to all of us. It's making us resilient to the future impacts of climate change. So this affordable project, in addition to looking beautiful, providing a sustainable home for people, is also adding extreme value to the community. I'm proud that in Arlington, we look at all projects as needing to deliver that, not just because we're bureaucratically rigid, but because we recognize that it can then help change the narrative about what affordable communities are. We still have work to do to get the wider community to understand who the residents of these communities are, so that they can get past their normative stereotypes about these people being less than or somehow unworthy of being considered full participants and stakeholders in the community, but I'll leave that for another forum. But what we believe, though, is that when it comes to development approvals, we have to make sure that we are looking holistically at ways at which this can benefit the entire community. So, where we cannot necessarily always deliver approvals and considerations on a time frame that most developers would like, we do think that where possible, we create efficiency. So with Terwilliger Place, you have this development that adjoins a couple of other parcels that had interest in redeveloping. And instead of looking at them separately, which probably would have created a lot of time in approvals, because there would have been these questions of unknown impacts from what other plans might be, we decided to look at them together holistically without specific projects in mind to determine what are the elements of infrastructure and other improvements that are needed for this area and to provide larger value. Once we had that plan in place, I think you then see the specific project approvals become much faster, because you've taken care of a lot of the big issues. Developers know exactly what's going to be required of them. And so, I think we're getting better at the bureaucratic margins of figuring out how to bridge that gap so that more resources can be put into affordability as opposed to bureaucracy and delay. But we're really fortunate in Arlington that I think we've got great buy-in that whether it's an affordable project or not, they're all going to deliver value to the wider community in addition to the mission of the project itself.
Okay. No, that's great. Thank you for that. And as part of that, right, we think about the improvements, and a lot of times improvements are, can make the project cost prohibitive. And a great example is here at Terwilliger Place. It benefited from the reduction of parking, right? It's 0.5 per unit, which is much higher per zoning. And so that allowed the project to actually go forward. So when you think about those things, what are some other examples? And I throw this out to Chuck, Laura, and Dennis. What are some other examples of changes or benefits that projects can have that might sort of expedite the process and bring the pricing down?
Well, I'll say I'm really inspired by the example in Chicago that just was passed, the Connected Communities Ordinance, which eliminated all on-site parking requirements for affordable homes in TOD areas, and that's all TOD, so rail and high-frequency bus service, as well as from a process perspective, kind of set a timeline for zoning commission making a decision on affordable projects. And I think things like that, along with simple things like training your development services staff on affordable housing timelines, or being able to kind of flex up, flex down your staff because they have the ability to kind of run different regulations, is, I think, something that I think could really help get things to the market faster.
That's great.
They say some estimates are that Ron would know, maybe Bruce. It costs $50,000 to have a parking space per. That adds $50,000 to the cost of the development of a unit if you have a one-space parking requirement. So, some more realism around that and more common sense around that would be very useful. I mean, Minneapolis eliminated off-street parking requirements. I think by right development is obviously a way to expedite the production of affordable housing. There are just a lot of things going on at the local level that could help the situation.
Yeah, Chuck?
And I would say to achieve some of these things, if the great goal of eliminating some of the parking requirements, we need to build up some other opportunities. So I'm talking about transportation, but I'm going to frame it as land use. So we need to optimize the walk shed around each of these nodes. Now, we all know that. What we're trying to think about more is beyond optimizing the half-mile walk shed, the mile bike shed. So more and more bicycling. How do we optimize straight ways to get there within a reasonable amount of time? And then 2-mile, how do we optimize the land use to get close to these opportunities? I'd call that the micro-transit shed. Perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself, but getting into the next decade, we see like the autonomous shuttle in the Mosaic area at National Harbor. So how do we get this great catchment area for more options for walking, for bicycling, for scooters, and for autonomous vehicles to get us to that opportunity? So I think the context can be improved if the housing planners, the transportation planners, and the city planners work together.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And you think about that too, trip generation, right? Not everybody's dependent on vehicular transportation, right? So with those tools you just talked about, you're actually generating more trips in a smaller urban area and also more environmentally friendly, right? So I think those are all good things. So thanks for that feedback and those questions. So the third topic is social benefits of growth and housing choice. So Chris, we're gonna come back to you on this one. So we're in North Arlington, and so for those who aren't familiar with Arlington, we've got a north and a south side. I'm a Southie, but there is a little bit of divide between kind of the north and the south. And the north is a wealthy part of the county that has historically underproduced housing, right? It's just a fact. So can you talk about what the county is doing to distribute more affordable housing more equitably, and why?
Thank you, Rich. So, our 3 planning corridors that we have, 2 of them, even though the Roslyn-Boston corridor in North Arlington is the largest in terms of, amount of space and also number of units and number of metro stations, but we also have 2 other planning corridors, Richmond Highway and Columbia Pike. Both of those are in South Arlington. And so as you look at the map of Arlington's 26 square miles and see how our planning corridors have developed, there is one gaping omission, one that we have not hitherto dealt with that we are currently dealing with. Hey, Paul Holland, the Lee Highway corridor. And so we've got one of our great community partners, Paul Holland, who is a part of the Plan Langston Boulevard process, which is looking to actually add density along Lee Highway because it's analogous to our Columbia Pike corridor in that it is served by fairly high capacity bus service that has the ability to ramp up even more. So we've got that transit investment that can serve residents along there, and it has been left alone, dare I say, protected from increases in density. Well, that's changing with this process to plan for more units along there. And then as we think about the bulk of Arlington's land area, like I said before, 60% of the people live on about 20% of the land. Well, 3/4 of our residential land that's available currently is restricted to only 1 home per parcel. And so we are looking at changing that paradigm to bring, certainly not to scale, but more gentle increases in density where it would naturally be desired for people as properties, change over. So that is going to primarily impact North Arlington because, many of those parcels exist in North Arlington, and it's part of our growth management moving forward that we're going to get away from some of the old style thinking that density, affordability, high capacity transit, that people needed to be protected from those. There was that thinking that still pervades in a lot of folks. And I think where we are in Arlington, hopefully, is not only breaking past some of those biases, but also demonstrating to people the benefits from it. Because this Plan Langston Boulevard process is not only about increasing residential density, it's about providing more opportunities for commercial reinvestment to create some of these urban villages that Arlington is known for all throughout the corridor so that you can create neighborhoods and senses of place along Langston Boulevard. And then by allowing more density to accrue into these neighborhoods, that are extremely low density, we provide an opportunity for businesses to be able to attract more customers and to sustain. And so, a lot of the things that we've done on the metro corridors, we can bring to areas of North Arlington that have been historically lower density. It won't be quite to the same scale, but it will replicate some of the best practices that we've done already.
Great, thank you. I was going to ask you how that's going so far. Got a little bit
We're
of
getting there.
chop on that.
We're kind of in the thick of it. So,
Got
but
it.
we're committed.
Well, keep doing the good work there. That's really great. So, Chuck and Laura, this question goes to you. So, how big of an issue is this region-wide? Right, we see this divide between areas of high opportunity and access to affordable housing. What is the Montgomery or the Metro Washington Council of Governments doing to change this?
So I think most precisely is geographic analysis that we call equity emphasis areas. So we analyzed all 1,300 census tracts of our region, almost 6 million people, to see which census tracts have the concentrations of low-income communities or concentrations of communities of color, all in this rubric of inclusive prosperity to make sure that these census tracts are part of the prosperity for our region. So I think how that manifests, and I'm a Southsider too. I don't know if we have a handshake yet, but
We do.
we do? Okay, well, I've been here 28 years. And I think that manifests that, the National Landic Potomac Yards, Virginia Tech campus is just going to be a juggernaut, economic juggernaut. And how do we make sure that those census tracts in South Arlington, census tracts along Columbia Pike are part of that? I think part of that is transportation. As transportation planners, we think of economic mobility as physical mobility, being able to get there. Of course, there's the educational mobility too, but the connecting of these census tracts. So it's an acupuncture chart, I think, of equity. These 1.5 million people live in these 364 census tracts. So whether it's the analysis that goes into mitigating gentrification on the Purple Line, or optimizing how the Blue Line corridor in Prince George's County has just got to succeed for this region, or in Fairfax County, the $750 million up to $1 billion investment in Embark Richmond Highway down the Route 1 corridor. Those census tracts along that corridor need to be part of that opportunity. So that's what I think it looks like. Where's the opportunity? Where's the equity? And make sure we have those lines as short as possible connecting those.
That's great. Laura, do you have?
I just wanted to add to that, I think I think all of that is so great. And I just want to add, I think another thing that we're learning both along the Purple Line, but through some of Enterprise's place-based work in places like Ward 8 is there's a lot of assets that exist in communities that sometimes we call low opportunity areas. And so the more and more we can also think about how do we invest in those areas, they may not be the housing investments, but the economic opportunities, the opportunities to center residents' interest and really improve them in ways that are going to benefit them the most. And they're the best people to tell us what those investments look like, the better off all of our region will be. And so it's so great to see, that equity being prioritized in so many different ways and all the work that's happening because it's so critical to helping everyone who lives in the region.
That's great. So that's great at the regional and the local level. Dennis, what about the national level?
Well, it's as Ron emphasizes, it's really critical that young kids and families have an opportunity to live in communities of opportunity. There's been groundbreaking research by a Harvard professor named Raj Chetty demonstrating that if children, families with children, or if those children move to a higher opportunity neighborhood very early in their lives, they have more likely to graduate from college, higher lifetime earnings, other very important social benefits. If they move as teenagers, there's no benefit, according to Shetty. So it's critical to get kids into those opportunity neighborhoods at an early age. One of the things we're looking at the Terwilliger Center is legislation by Todd Young, a Republican, and I have to say a U.S. Naval Academy graduate, Center. There seems to be a theme here about the Naval Academy, and Chris Van Hollen. They have supported legislation to create vouchers, mobility vouchers, for families with very young children to move into higher opportunity neighborhoods. I don't think this is top secret, Ron, but we're also exploring a potential new federal tax incentive that would encourage private investment in the development of mixed income rental housing. And that's sort of consistent with the idea of having young kids and families in these neighborhoods of opportunity, which have tremendous benefits over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So the last topic that we'll touch on is leveraging nonprofit partnerships to build affordable housing. APA's benefited from that. Somebody mentioned that earlier. We've got 2 projects, CUMC, which is under development right now in Ballston. We've got Gillian Place on Columbia Pike that finished. Fantastic. But those are in partnership with churches. And so, Laura, this question goes to you. Enterprise, your company, works on fostering faith-based partnerships. So can you describe more about this initiative and what do you see as the biggest barriers?
Yeah, so the Faith-Based Development Initiative at Enterprise, I think, really operates in the same spirit as the project we're celebrating today. It takes mission-driven or non-traditional landholders who might have a vision for a community of people or a community of place and equips them to be able to engage in affordable housing development. In the case of the Faith-Based Initiative, it's houses of worship. And we at Enterprise work to equip houses of worship to engage in the development process, so to understand what the development process looks like, technical assistance to help them decide what might make sense to develop on the properties that they own, as well as grants and capital to enable them to then realize those visions. And I'll say we're talking about the need to scale and the need for more supply. Urban Institute quantified the property that houses of worship own in the region. It's upwards of over 700 acres, which, depending on the zoning, could produce anywhere from like 40,000 to over 100,000 units. So we have about 100,000 of those 300 on lock. And I think some of the biggest barriers are just, being able to translate the development process to institutions that want to be part of the solution, but may not always have the same language or the same training. And so it does take, the time and the energy to do that. And that's what our initiative focuses on. That's
great. So Chuck and Christian, as you think about Arlington and the region strategically, what are some of the things they can continue to do to capitalize on nonprofit owned sites? And then what about public land?
The institutional partnerships are absolutely essential part of our future. APAH has capitalized on this more than any other nonprofit organization in Arlington, and we're thrilled with the results. But we've looked at these sort of non-traditional ways of building housing for a while now. So an old community center that was scheduled for redevelopment, we decided to shrink the footprint of the community center, take it up vertically, and use the remainder of the property for affordable housing. We're looking at working with corporate partners and have been thrilled in the last couple of years that through JBG and the Washington investment pool, what's it called again? I forget, Andy. Washington Housing Conservancy and the investment pool there, we've got now corporate partners who are in the work of housing preservation. So as we think about the way forward, it's going to be looking at all of the various institutional partners that you can develop. Now, a great source are the mission-driven ones, whether they be nonprofits or houses of worship, because it's clearly a part of their plan forward to serve the community, a reduced need for profit and return. That's great, but that's not the only way. As I think we look at institutions writ large, there's ample opportunity to maybe think about non-traditional sources like hospitals, other corporate entities which see the value of ensuring that all of their workers, not just those who can economically compete, but all who serve that industry, have an opportunity to live proximate and close to transit. So I see this as sort of, I don't want to think about it like it's faddish, but this is, I think, one of the next areas of real groundbreaking improvement that we can make is thinking about housing with institutional partners who are not in the housing business, but who nonetheless should be.
Chuck?
Yeah, I think the partnerships is the only way that we're going to get there. And how do we galvanize stronger public sector, private sector investment, like the Washington Housing Conservancy and the partnerships with nonprofit organizations. My organization was benefited from a $500,000 grant from Amazon, and the whole idea was a mini grant to try to get some of these ideas moving forward. I don't want to speak for Carmen, but I think in her shoes, there's just not a lot of unrestricted funding, pre-development money to try to move things. So that was the idea to move, and we moved, I think, 10 along, and I think APAH got one of these grants for a new initiative in the district. So if we're going to get to that 351 of these places in our region to get to that 75,000 delta that we really need in terms of production, but in the right place, meaning in transit, it's going to need to take all of those partnerships. And before I give up the microphone, I want to not commit a faux pas, and that is I want to acknowledge Christian Dorsey. Besides all of this leadership in Arlington, he's the leader of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments as board chair, has been right in the middle of setting these housing targets for the region, cajoling, working with all of his counterparts, elected officials to pull even stronger in this area. So thank you, Christian. And full-throated endorsement from me as head of the Council of Governments, but also as a citizen of Arlington. This important study on the missing middle that could unlock some potential for solving some of these things in Arlington. It's very, very important.
Well, thank you. That's a great topic. I wish we had time to delve into that, but I think we're kind of pushing up on time. But I do want to thank Dennis, Laura, Chuck, and Christian for their input. Again, subject matter experts, great discussion. I really appreciate the input. So at this time, we'll open up for just a couple minutes for any questions from the audience to the extent folks have any. Yes, sir.
Is Arlington County growing population-wise year after year?
We were before COVID, but like many metro areas, we project a population decrease of a few thousand during the COVID years. But absent that, taking away that anomaly, Arlington over the last decade grew at a 1.5% annualized rate, which slightly exceeded what had been like our 30-year annualized growth rate, usually around 1.2%. But we enjoy steady, robust growth in the communities.
How many citizens of Arlington?
About 235,000 at this point.
Fairfax is, how's it compared to the other?
So,
Fairfax.
yeah, go ahead. Well, Fairfax is like 1.1, 1.2 million.
I think in perspective, I ballpark about 600,000 people join us in the region every decade. A lot of that is foreign migration as opposed to domestic migration, but people coming here for opportunity. Then I kind of got to do the math in my head, and that means about 360 people joining us in the region this weekend. 360 people. Now, if that's all cul-de-sacs and single-family housing, that's a lot of cul-de-sacs. But, a couple key multifamily, we can keep pace. If we don't keep pace, there's a couple 100,000 job openings we're stymieing the economy. So thank you, sir, for asking the demographics question to get me back on my stump speech.
Yeah. Do you have a question, Matt?
Yeah, I was curious from maybe either Laura or Dennis. You talked a little bit about a way to overcome NIMBYs of these examples, right? And the building itself is a big part of that. But the other part of it is the people. And we've talked a lot about that at APAH, about bringing forward more stories of the residents of the housing. These are your neighbors. These are, essential workers. And I'm just curious, have you seen in other communities effective ways that folks have been able to tell the story of the human side of this, which would help us as we continue to do the work of breaking down those barriers?
Well, I'll say, one of the most powerful things I've seen, and I'll say this from my neighborhood in Washington, D.C. to places all over I've worked, is to have a constituency that transcends just the people living in the properties that, like this one, to be able to stand up and say, I want this in my neighborhood, to be able to have multiple people at city council speak on behalf of projects like this and the importance and the value to the community. I've seen as the most powerful one, particularly because, we continue to experience various power differentials. Our processes are not always set up for people who are going to benefit the most to show up and speak on behalf of these. And so sometimes I think the most powerful voice can be the ones that can show up and say it's important, even if you're not going to directly benefit.
Great.
We've recently conducted a poll, which we haven't released yet, but it shows a lot of bipartisan support for many of the initiatives we're going to support on supply, on preservation, homelessness, those issues. The lowest that come in are local zoning reform, and because you're right, there people are concerned about how that's going to affect them. So what we're trying to do is elevate good examples. We're running a digital media ad that will hopefully elevate cities like Minneapolis and a state like Utah. This is a perennial issue from federal policy. I mean, it's how do you overcome these barriers? Jack Kemp was talking about this nearly 30 years ago, and it's do you do it with federal? Do you carrots? Do you condition funding? Do you punish? From the federal side, I lean more towards the carrot and cajoling, but we need to, you're absolutely right. I mean, the premise of your question is we need to elevate examples of how affordable housing like this beautiful development really enhances a community, and is nothing to be afraid of. In fact, it's something to be welcomed, and so it's an ongoing problem.
So we're going to go with David, and then we'll go to Andy.
Yeah, a question for Christian and Chuck. We're getting ready to commission a capital needs analysis to try to really quantify, not just research has been done on how many units are needed, right? But the notion of how much will that cost and what kind of capital it will need. Ron talked about preservation, production, and vouchers. So we've heard mention of Kaiser, Chase, JBG Smith, obviously Amazon. I'm curious if you all have had experience, and if so, what that's been like in engaging corporate partners of, beyond those who kind of the usual suspects now, the handful that are out there, to try to get a critical mass of corporate partners involved in pooling dollars, not just from their philanthropic side, but also kind of the treasury sides of their house, to really be a part of the solution at a level of scale where it's not a onesie-twosies, but it becomes a real movement of corporates who are in partnership with government, putting the resources on the table that are needed.
I'll say they've now become one of the usual suspects, but Amazon wasn't that. Before, I think there was a concerted engagement and their willing participation in having conversations before, they went through the process of entitling their second headquarters in Arlington, where, we had the time as part of that building of relationship to really talk about not only our community's needs, but how we felt like it was something that was essential for their success in building HQ2 to not, one, contribute to, but then take the lead in helping others come together to deal with our housing issue, recognizing that was going to be a talent challenge for them moving forward with building HQ2 if this existential issue of housing inadequacy in terms of supply and unaffordability in terms of housing cost burden wasn't addressed, and that their role could be significant in alleviating it. It took a lot of time, and we don't have those kinds of relational opportunities with lots of non-usual suspects. So we have to, we're constantly thinking about how do we create that space where we can engage in months of discussion and understanding for them to get those links, because they're just not intuitive. So I think I'm putting out the call for, I'd love the help of the wisdom of the many people in this room, how we can make that a little bit more systematized so that we don't have to look opportunistically for an Amazon to come to the table that wants to engage, but we can maybe make this a part of the regular order of business. So help us.
I think 4 categories, and thank you, David. You've been a thought leader. I've learned so much from you over the last 20 years. I think the four categories would be, yes, the usual suspects. Look at the corporations. What are the banks doing? What's Capital One doing? What are the major defense contractors doing? Boeing comes here. What could they do? But beyond that, Carmen's helped me think about EDS. We think about EDS and MEDS. So what are the opportunities with universities, the land that they have? I think that's very ripe. The beds, meaning the hospitals and their campuses. And then there might be an opportunity to work in a new way with the federal government, meaning military installations. Where I'm coming from is, what's the biggest employer in Fairfax County? I might think of Capital One, might think of Inova, or it's Fort Belvoir. Mm-hmm. So, and the state of housing for folks that work on military installations, work there but live in the county, just is not what it should be. That I think has a lot of potential.
Great. We have time for one last question, Andy, and then we'll wrap up.
I mean, I was thinking about, the Legion and churches and available land, and, just from having been very close to this recently, there's a massive supply of land available under office buildings, right? And I'd say most of those office buildings, if not a large percentage, are approaching debt value, and there's going to be a massive foreclosure process over the coming years. And I think about you, Chuck, and Christian, what we can do to get ahead of that with appropriate zones and thinking of where office is sitting in high opportunity areas and how those conversions are going to happen. How do we kind of promote those, how do we push that, and as a region, we can probably find a tremendous land bank or actual built structures that we can do a kind of a wholesale conversion on and maybe drive additional units. And I think if we can get ahead of it, it's 3 to 4 years out, loans are being shopped today, but no one's buying, and they're all going to get keys turned back over. You're starting to see, I think there's an incredible opportunity to kind of find housing opportunities in the region.
Oh, I think the Washington Business Journal would want to be all over that, so I hope that you do an op-ed there. I think Deputy Mayor John Falchicchio in the district, he and others, there needs to be more of that, what is it called, adaptive reuse and conversion. So this is a great idea. We don't have time, but let me just plug that as a 5-star idea.
Great.
And I'll plug our county manager who, as we were looking at our emerging from our COVID impacts, really challenged Arlington County staff to start thinking creatively about the office built environment and what its future was and what would be our useful tools, ranging from more easily permitting non-permitted uses to facilitating adaptive reuse, so that we're trying to do something that local governments are not usually known for, and that is looking far into the future to deal with these existential issues. So, give that guy back there a little bit of credit for some visionary forward thinking.
Awesome. Well, thank you all, and thank you to our panel for a great discussion. And next up is Bobby Rozen. He's going to be talking about state and local financing tools.
My name is Bobby Rozen. I'm a member of the APAH board. I feel like I should start by asking if there's anybody in the audience that is a graduate of West Point. Nobody? Everybody's naval. Okay, somebody's father. Well, I'm not going to claim to be a graduate of West Point, but I did visit it this summer, and it's a beautiful campus. Maybe almost as beautiful as the Naval Academy. As I said, I'm a member of the APAH board. I've been on the board for about 12 years, and I have a affordable housing public policy background. I feel very privileged to be a part of APAH. I've learned so much, even though I've been working in policy for, 35 or so years. I've really learned the most serving on the APAH board. And I'm so impressed with the intelligence, the dedication, the creativity of our staff when it comes to building the best quality, affordable housing and providing great quality services to our residents. But we couldn't do this alone. We benefit tremendously from our partners, most of whom are here today and are on this panel. Developing affordable housing, as we all know, is difficult work. It requires ingenuity, creativity, because you have to combine so many sources of financing, the so-called capital stack. And for each development, it's a little bit different. This property, Terwilliger Place, is a prime example of that. It was financed by federal low-income housing tax credits allocated by Susan's agency, Virginia Housing, and sold to Capital One through Debbie's company, the National Equity Fund. And in addition to low-interest debt provided by Virginia Housing, also we had low-interest debt from the Department of Housing and Community Development, and of course Arlington County, who has been an enormous supporter of ours over the years. And the property used tax-exempt financing as well. We also, on this property, as Matt mentioned, did something a little bit different. We utilized a good deal of charitable money from a variety of sources, most notably from Ron and Fran Terwilliger, but also from the APAH board, and from Amazon and others in our community. And as difficult as it is to develop affordable housing today, the challenge has gotten even greater in the last 2 or 3 years as developers work to secure scarce tax credits, as tax-exempt bond authority gets capped out, as interest rates rise, and particularly as construction costs just surge forward. According to a recent study that came out 2 days ago from the National Council of State Housing Agencies, estimates are that construction costs rose almost 30% since the pandemic. And so how do we continue to put together these deals with different sources of capital? And that's the subject of our panel today. On the far right of you, Bryan Horn is the Secretary of the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development, which provided Virginia Housing Trust Fund resources to this property and has a variety of housing programs. Susan Dewey is the longtime CEO of Virginia Housing. I think almost 25 years. You might be approaching the dean of all of the housing finance agencies across the country.
I started at 5, though.
Yes. And that's what I say. I started at 12 doing policy. She is the source of our tax credit equity and low interest loans, and just an essential partner. We love Susan and her staff, and because she's so critical to us, and we hope you love us back. Debbie Burkart is the foremost expert in the country on using the housing credit to build affordable housing for veterans. She provided technical assistance and some seed money to get this property going. And she works for our equity provider, the National Equity Fund, which is an affiliate of the Local Initiative Support Corporation, a national nonprofit. It's very similar to Enterprise, which Ron is a longtime board chairman of. David Swift is with Amazon Housing Equity Fund, which is devoting more than $2 billion of commitment to preserve and create more than 20,000 units of affordable housing in the 3 communities where they have a high concentration of their workforce: Seattle, Nashville, and Arlington. And we're very, very excited to partner with Amazon on a number of properties in our pipeline. We couldn't be happier. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for agreeing to serve on this panel. I'm going to start with Susan. Terwilliger Place was funded by the traditional model of debt and low-income housing tax credit equity, in addition to other sources. Through debt financing and tax credits, Virginia Housing either directly lent or facilitated over $53 million for this property. Demand for state public financing is now higher than ever. The need is higher, and so the demand is higher. Do you foresee any increase in Virginia housing's lending or a change in your priorities as you decide where to lend and award credits going forward?
That's a great question. And first of all, yes, I definitely love you, Bobby, and all this group for all that you're doing up here. And, you know, as we talk about the resources needed, and there certainly is a lot of that, I think we've got to continue to celebrate what we all in this room are making happen, thanks to APAH, the donors, the funders, your staff, your board, everybody. So we want to celebrate when we do have a success. But, you know, it is very difficult, Bobby, as you know, because you've been an advocate at the national level, and we appreciate the work you've done with our national association. We've actually lost ground when you think about it with resources. Not only do we need a lot more tax credits, for example, but about 4 years ago, we got an additional allocation of 12.5% in the state of Virginia, and we're hopeful that would be permanent and increased in the Build Back Better legislation. That didn't happen. So this year we lost 12.5% of tax credits. That is huge, because tax credits are the number one means of getting affordable housing produced. And similarly, over time, I don't know if many of you will remember that some time ago, the HUD decided to afford a new model for public housing called RAD, Rental Assistance Demonstration Project. And with that, it would rely on tax credits for the first time, a new model for the public housing population. Well, I remember, along with our National Association, advocating that if you were going to do that, you needed to give more tax credits. It didn't. And so now we see, and we're big supporters of public housing, but that is utilizing a lot of our tax credits also. So demand is certainly increasing. We talked a lot earlier in the panel about supply issues, lack of inventory, and it's causing us at the state level, along with my partner here, Bryan at DHCD, we're really going to have to look at how we prioritize the resources that we do have, and how those are being allocated across the state. And it's going to be, I think, very difficult going forward for all of us. We're looking at some new models. For example, we have a mixed-use, mixed-income program now that is able to give us more workforce housing. And I think you were saying earlier about the missing middle, and that helps, I think, with the workforce housing in addition to market rate. So that is another thing that's helping that doesn't rely on federal programs. But it is going to take us working together at how we prioritize everything. And we do work together. We listen a lot to our partners. I know Carmen and Mike are on some of our advisory boards, and that's a good impact. We also do have public forums. We're starting back next year for our QAP, Qualified Allocation Plan, and that goes along with the allocation of the tax credits. And what we see, that's a great prioritization system. The way we run it in Virginia is very quantitative, points-driven, very transparent. And over time, we have driven things like energy efficiency, transit-orient development. We have given points for new construction when we saw the need up here in Northern Virginia for new construction as well as preservation. And most recently with DEI efforts, because we know how important diversity, equity, and inclusion is, and we're trying to put points in there to drive participation with minority partners. So that's going to mean we're going to have to all kind of sharpen our pencils and work together and make sure we, while we are advocating at the federal level and at the state level for more resources, we're also good stewards of the resources that we currently have.
Thank you. Let me ask a question of Bryan. Of course, your agency, the Department of Housing and Community Development, is the other critical agency for affordable housing in Virginia. This property, Terwilliger Place, benefited from Housing Trust Fund money as well as home funds that you administer from the federal government. As the new administration looks forward on housing, what are your priorities?
That's a loaded question, and also one that we could be here for several hours on, depending on how poetic I wanted to wax. Firstly, I want to thank everyone, and especially Carmen, for inviting us. This is a perfect example of how housing done right will be successful. So I think the biggest picture thing I can say is housing is a priority of this administration. Okay, it just is. Sustainable and attainable housing that people can afford to live in. You know, I try to understand things simply. For me, every dollar that's spent on your housing is a dollar you cannot spend in the overall economy. It's a dollar that we can't use to stimulate the creation of other jobs and to stimulate our economic activity. Economic development's key for Virginia to stay number one and to continue in that position, which we will do. We found that housing is it's a multi-dimensional, it's a multivariate problem. If I wanted to reduce housing to how I understand it, it's an equation. I mean, housing's a function of land, suppliers, consumers, and cash incentives. Land's comprised of many things, not just the price of land, it's the availability of land. It's to the degree to which land is restricted from use. I love that office idea where you have, because no one's making more land, you can't print land. And it also involves the requirement for a willing seller. And when you start there, you realize that it is definitely a supply problem. And we're hearing some different supplies of different things with respect to financing the supply of housing tax credits. The Housing Trust Fund is now $75 million a year during this biennial. So, in terms of priorities for the administration, we're going to identify, and we're developing the policies now, but we're going to identify the things that we think will help solve the problem, because the real problem in front of us is what's in between us and more units in the ground. And more units in the ground could be new construction, preserved units, or reuse. But we do know that we've been hit with 2 or 3 right crosses and uppercuts that we were not expecting. Okay, the demographic issue alone, with different generations of different sizes coming together and frankly being around at the same time, produces pressure on housing. We did not expect a credit bubble back in 08 and 09. We're still dealing with that. And Lord knows we did not expect COVID. So it would have been a normal enough problem if we didn't have those other things. Because of that, and because we want to try to understand what it's going to take to put more units in the ground, we conducted listening sessions. We went all around the state. Carmen was here at the one in Northern Virginia. And we gathered together players in the housing field that included the suppliers of housing, but included nonprofits, local government, state government. And we asked, what is in the way between us and more units? And 4 things basically came out of that. And they are zoning and land use restrictions. We heard about that. Regulatory hurdles. Okay. Another item is workforce. I represented contractors in my former life. They were having problems getting qualified workforce 10 years ago. It's even worse now. And then also the affordability piece. So it's multidisciplinary, it's multivariate. But with respect to those priorities, I think the priority number 1 is we want to ramp up the number of units that are going in, and we want to do it faster. Sounds simple, it's tough to solve, but that's our main priority.
Thank you. Well, let me put this next question to both Bryan and Susan. The affordable housing development community has been chagrined to learn, I guess chagrin's a good word, that the state is coming up against the private activity bond cap, the allocation which the federal government permits for private activity bonds in the state. And that has been such a critical source of financing, not only for APAH, but around the state. And Susan, your agency in particular, has done a terrific job of getting more and more developers to use that source of funds. So can you share with us, how do you expect the state will deal with this issue moving forward? And how do you manage the allocations between Virginia Housing, local housing authorities, the industrial development supply, and the governor's allocation?
Why don't you take it, Dean?
Okay. So this is a huge issue right now. We realize that. I don't know if everyone knows, but the Code of Virginia allocates tax-exempt bond cap, a precious resource. But as Bryan said, back in 2008, what we saw because of that credit bubble is that demand for the usage of tax-exempt bonds dwindled. Now, we used to use tax-exempt bonds for our home ownership program, and we moved to a securitization platform, which has worked well, and we've continued with that, so we don't have to use tax-exempt bond cap. But over the last 10 or more years, the portion of the cap that went to the industrial development authorities was really not utilized. Maybe every now and then there was probably 2 projects or 3 projects over the course of all that decade. And even the local government, there's a local government pool that goes through housing authorities. That was not completely used. Fortunately, any leftover cap, including leftover from the governor's pool, rolls to Virginia Housing. And because we have ongoing programs, we can continue to carry over anything that's unutilized. And our philosophy has been no cap left behind. So what we're proud to say is over that entire period when others were not using it very much, we were able to utilize it. And that included, we did come up at, while we've always prioritized rental, we came up with a mortgage credit certificate to help first-time home buyers as well, but it's back now. It's all back to rental now because we're seeing demand through the IDB pool, Industrial Development Bond Pool. We're seeing demand, heavy demand going to the governor's office, local governments. We're utilizing all of ours and have quite a lot of applications, more than ever, coming in. And one of the things, of course, we'd like to say in that prioritization scheme, also, Bobby, is the fact that you get a double benefit when you use this for housing because you can also use the 4% tax credits. And that is incredibly valuable for developments to be able to pair the 4% tax credits with the tax-exempt bonds. And so we're hoping that that will be considered because I think, in my opinion, going forward, we've really got to all work together to prioritize how that bond cap has been used because all too frequently it's been on a first-come, first-served basis. I'm not sure that always gets to the priorities that we're addressing through the 9% program. And so I think we're going to all have to, once again, as I said, sharpen the pencils and look at how we are prioritizing that. Even such things as, how are we doing it regionally? How are we doing it preservation versus new construction, housing versus industrial development? Of course, one of the things that I think is important, and Bryan touched on this earlier, is that incredible link. You hear of industrial development, but housing is economic development. And I think that message gets lost a lot on our legislators, but it's so critically important to economic development. So we're working together to now look and work with Virginia Economic Development Partnership and locals to say, if we want jobs to come into your area, our state, where are those people going to live? And one of the things that we did recently to try to get that regional conversation going is a $40 million grant program from our own internal resources to get all of the planning district commissions across the state looking at housing and how they can work together. And it wasn't just one jurisdiction, but looking at the regional impact of jobs announcements. So we're working on it. It's a challenge. Bryan, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Well, I think you said it perfectly. I think the optimistic things to take out of this, the governor's real big on not having silos. That's happening. I've had more. We have regular and routine meetings involving strategic planning with Virginia Housing, with VEDP, because even if no other site came to our state, we have an underlying baseline kind of need, baseline temperature. When a site comes into a region, that temperature goes up. And so there are different things we're going to need to do to be able to deal with existing need, but also how to deal with these spot needs as they arise. And And the only way you do it is working together, talking with each other. And that sounds trite, but it's mindful. It's aimed talking. And one thing though we run up against, and it's not an excuse, it's just the fact. When it comes to the private activity bonds and their need, that is a pie that is set each year of one size. And once that's set, we have a statutory mechanism that tells us how big the main slices are going to be. Virginia Housing gets the biggest slice. After that's industrial development, and what's left is between the local housing authority and then the governor's pool. Okay, so automatically we have way more people wanting a piece of pie and a small pie to go around. After that, you also are faced with federal regulation, and this is federal level. So there's really only but so much you can do at the state. You also have a requirement that a percentage of the private activity bonds have to be used as part of the financing of the project. Right now, it's like 50%. It's 50%. Okay, if that dropped, it would be like making the pie bigger. Okay, and between the statutes that authorize the size of the pie versus that rule may be a little easier to change, quite frankly. And so, with private activity bonds and their availability, driving tax credits, which drives this engine of creating housing that's affordable. The key here, I think, is we're going to need some relief at the federal level. Just saying. So,
get on that, Bobby.
Right.
We're working on it.
Exactly. Because when we want to if we want to look at strictly area median income, the percentage that is affordable, that is what is affordable housing, that percentage has been going up and up. And it's been going up and up into income levels that did not expect that. People growing up did not expect to not be able to buy a house, including millennials who are now, as I understand, into their 40s in some. And so that's just one way to define the crisis. And it is definitely going to take all levels of government, not just state, to be able to try to solve this if we're going to do it in anything close to a near term. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Next question for David. So Amazon, of course, is a private company that has recognized the importance of treating affordable housing as a necessary investment. You've made some tremendous commitments. Why did you make this decision to set up the Housing Equity Fund? I guess we had this similar question, but in the last panel, how can we get more of the private sector to see the value of investing in affordable housing?
Well, first off, thanks for inviting me to be here. Amazon is very much committed to the belief that affordable housing is a right, and while it is up to the government to solve this crisis, there is a role and a place for private industry to get involved. Amazon is committed to tens of thousands of jobs in the region. We could not fill those jobs if there's not affordable housing for the people coming in. I had conversations with people who were on the selection committee who picked Arlington, and part of the reason they picked this area is that there was a housing infrastructure and building housing, whereas in other areas that were also competing for the HQ2 space, they could look at it and say they could never support Amazon's workforce. The housing infrastructure isn't there, the groups aren't there. So these commitments, the hard work of people doing it here in Arlington is what made it possible for Amazon to come to this region. It's absolutely a necessity, and Amazon sees the value and importance of supporting that, is that we want to be a good partner and member of the community. We're here for the long term. We're here to help support the growth of Arlington and our other hometown communities beyond just these first 5 years, whatever the commitments are. It's that this is for good. We're here for the long term, and we want to be a member of the community, and we're very excited to have this opportunity to make these investments and to support affordable housing in the markets.
So we've heard a consistent theme from a number of panelists that continued economic growth really depends on the availability of housing that's affordable to the workforce. That's so true. It would be great if more policymakers understood that fundamental principle. Let me ask you, how does this region, which is made up of a lot of jurisdictions, but which seems like, in my view, I don't know everywhere in the country, has a real commitment by its elected officials to address the affordable housing problem. How does our situation compare to the other two main markets, Nashville and Seattle?
I think first off, Arlington and the DC region has an incredible group of thought leaders, the policy people here, the innovative solutions being created. It allowed the Housing Equity Fund to plug into an existing network of great thought and to get involved very quickly in some very excellent projects that in other markets have been slower on the upkeep or uptake on the money that Amazon has sort of pledged to those areas. Obviously, Nashville and Seattle also have these challenges, but I think Arlington and many East Coast cities have known for a long time that continued growth outward was never going to be a solution, that there had to be a plan for infill and redevelopment, and especially around these transit efforts that really helped the Housing Equity Fund hit the ground running in especially the DMV HQ2 region. So it's been an incredibly great partnership for Amazon to plug in with APAH and many of the people here and get involved with them and jump onto the projects they already had running. It wasn't like we had to come in and start whole new efforts. Everybody here is working very hard and is driving towards a goal. Amazon just had to get in and help push, basically.
So let me turn to a question that anybody in the group could answer, dealing with acquisition and preservation funding. One of the biggest challenges in affordable housing is competing for acquisitions, either for land or expiring affordable housing properties. In this case, we had two nonprofits come together. We had mission-minded seller, the American Legion, and we had APAH, and we were able to work out a deal. They actually put it out there, and we competed against other entities, but they really were mission-oriented for affordable housing and wanted to do business with us. But in many cases, the market moves too quickly for nonprofits. How do you think that developers can address this issue? Are there any public or private sources for quick acquisition and preservation funding, Deb?
Yeah, I did want to say that NEF is the largest not-for-profit syndicator in the country and mission-driven. And so occasionally when we see gaps, like lack of funding in a certain area or lack of focus, like in veterans housing, we step in with LISC as our partner to create initiatives. Around preservation, NEF developed a preservation fund, and we're approaching $2 billion in dollars that we've spent. And that has been pretty much through word of mouth with developers who have NOAA properties, and they come to us, and we're able to make a decision pretty much within 30 to 45 days and get funds out fairly quickly within another 45 days. And that's because of a partnership we've developed with an investor. And so the requirement is that 51% of the units will have to have a restriction at 80% of AMI. We are a quick kind of like preservation acquisition bridge. So the goal is like we could go up to 97% loan to value, and then anything above 75% loan to value starts to be kind of like an equity interest rate. So the rate drops dramatically. But we use this tool, which was very interesting, in Seattle for the quick acquisition of 2 market rate properties for homeless housing. I'm the managing director of supportive housing. I've been working in supportive housing for about 30 years. And I sit on CSH's national board as well. So when we saw through the pandemic, I said, hey, we got this preservation tool over here that I don't really get to use too often because my folks can't pay any advertising debt. But the city of Seattle had a wealth of a hodgepodge of operating subsidies, from federal to the fact that they pass a VETS levy, and then there's OMR. So there's a bunch of different pots of rent subsidies. They pushed together and bought this market rate building. We were the top 10 million, and then we had the city and the state behind us with gap financing. And then they were able to house. We closed within 60 days, and they were able to start moving people in 30 days later. And we immediately, it was basically a market rate developer who missed the market. He was building in two very attractive areas of the Seattle community, but they were selling lifestyle over square footage. And with COVID, folks wanted the square footage, and they couldn't hit the rents. So I'm just saying that we're trying to be nimble when we see opportunities and stretch our current products to meet new needs.
I would also say we've been talking about the position of private capital and private investment from companies like Amazon. We're hoping the Housing Equity Fund will provide a model for more companies to get into this space because they can so easily provide quick strike capital. Our largest investment to date was the Barcroft on the Columbia Pike. It's a very large property, and it was going to face going out to become market rate if Amazon and Arlington County had not been able to work together very quickly on a very tight time frame to get it funded and turned to a new developer. And so that is one of the big advantages of a situation like an Amazon, and hopefully other companies in the future will see that and put their commitments in because they can provide quick strike capital to support acquisition of existing affordable housing.
Thank you. Let's talk about funding for specialized populations and services, Deb. As we all know, Terwilliger Place has a leasing preference for veterans. As the equity provider, Deb, you took the APAH team to tour other veterans projects, and we learned a lot. And you and the NEF have a specialized focus on investing in veterans housing. What have you learned are the biggest needs for veterans in terms of housing and services?
Well, we started doing our first vets only housing in 2007. And we thought, what a great idea. We were going to work with that consultant in different markets. But at that time, the VA could barely say the word permanent supportive housing. And so then 2009 opened up an opportunity when the VASH program was reinvigorated. So it was like a dormant program from 1990. Got our first 10,000 VASH. So now we're at 107,000 VASH. So we saw the opening for an initiative and went to created Bring Them Homes with LISC and raised over $8 million from Citi and MetLife Foundation and Northrop Grumman to provide pre-development grant funds. And so with that, the idea was, in certain circumstances, was to take people to think big, and then you revise often. But so the idea was to think bigger for this site. When I heard from Bobby that the American Legion Post was selling for affordable housing, I thought, well, here's a news story that's, and it could be a blueprint. We have a problem of affordable housing, well, affordable land, and also land that's well located. We've all talked about opportunity areas. So there is across the country, the aging of the American Legion Post population who are land rich and cash poor. And so with, I took a key person from the local post along with a small group of Carmen and her team to see my vets only projects that had been built in Connecticut and New York. And some were on a former Army Reserve base, one was on a enhanced use lease project on a VA medical campus, and another was on private land. And what we learned from that was that, and it was great for them to meet the veterans, is that they say, I don't live just next door to neighbors. I live next door to my brothers and my sisters. And so what you're getting in veteran housing is a support network. And that's peer-on-peer support that is like an added-on efficient service in order to help people in their recovery. So, and what I'm seeing in this country that's like still frustrating after doing supportive housing for 30 years is that there were just three things we need to do housing for homeless. And we're seeing more and more people slip into homelessness with the lack of affordability, rents rising, and the supply lagging. And that's where you need coordination between rent subsidies, low-cost capital, and services. So that was kind of like, that's why I was drawn to doing a veterans initiative, because I'd been doing a lot of supportive housing. And I thought, okay, I got the VA, here, and that might be easier to work with than HHS. Well, it's been challenges, but I think what we can do more permanent supportive housing, I think we have a lot of cool tools out there, but we just need to create more efficiencies, like a national HHS service program, so that community-based organizations aren't piecing together a patchwork and braiding together grants from a variety of philanthropic foundations. We need to have a more coordinated system, and we need to give the state agencies more project-based, more rent subsidies, and then also through the agencies to create a better project-basing program. So when you're giving low-cost capital, throw in the rent subsidies. And so just to quickly end is that an example of an inefficiency was that when the VA decided to do a homeless program, they said, hey, we have all this excess building and land on VA medical campuses, services right there. They had millions of excess building and land at no cost to the developer. They picked like 30 to 40 developers, and then they never matched it with the HUD-VASH program. So a lot of those projects took 5 years to get off the ground. So that's kind of what we, at a smaller level here in Virginia and in Arlington County, I would just advise we have to have more coordination of limited resources to do some of this targeted tough housing so we can shorten the timeline and just rather than do the multiple application process.
Thank you, Deb. So I'll put this question to the group as well. Concerning development costs, we've talked about how much the cost of development has gone up and what a strain that is on the system. And that the National Council of State Housing Agencies just came out with this report about high costs. And also your brethren in the HFAs across the country are working on recommended practices for addressing the cost issue. Do you see any, I'm looking at you, Susan, but anybody can answer this. Do you see any potential for funding innovative construction technology, such as manufactured housing offsite or mass timber or other means to reduce the cost of development?
Well, we at Virginia Housing have really been looking at this, and particularly innovation in construction. We just did a 3D print home in Richmond,
wow.
Which was exciting to see that. And the idea, of course, is time is money, and if you can get this done much faster, I think ultimately being able to do that at scale is going to be critical. Also, our support of something that is rolled steel modular housing, which we called shipping container homes. We're looking at getting a producer of that type of housing to relocate from Idaho to Virginia. So we're hoping that will happen. And the whole concept, I think, of manufactured modular housing is something we need to give a lot more credibility, because if you think about it, it's in a factory-controlled environment. It can be produced quickly, and I think there's not been the acceptance of that there should be. In fact, we had an innovation pool with our tax credits a few years ago, and there was a developer that just did a modular multifamily development in Fisherville, and so we're seeing it both in rental and new home construction. But when we think about innovation, really, we got to go beyond just construction. We got to think out of the box at how we can use, this hospitals we heard about earlier, and how we can use land that's owned by our education facilities. And we've already done churches a lot with APAH. So we've got to think out of the box in terms of financing tools, construction methodology. And there's, we've got to get more creative, because we already talked about the fact that we don't have enough resources. So we've got to work together, which you said earlier, Deb, and try to get this done faster and more efficiently.
And with that, Susan, like we are on the West Coast doing a lot of manufactured housing, and I think it would be important if like NCSHA together, got the lessons learned, because there have been some missteps in the sense that, one is the construction lending community, they don't want to put out their money because there's nothing to pay for while it's being built on the plant. So then you need a lot of public money up front, like through the innovation set-asides, to pay that front cost in the plant, to get get them to put you in their pipeline. So, but these are just like lessons learned, which is great, because Virginia could like benefit from other people's. We've had a couple of missteps, but at the same time, I think they're, like you said, quality control. But then again, you have to remember, when you ship it, you got to make sure that it's covered, or else you get mold when it rains. Right. So there's been like it's been an interesting saga. But we did do our first mass timber project. We just closed on it in Connecticut, and while it's a little bit more expensive, I think it actually has a lot of cost efficiencies and operational efficiencies long term. So that's another product type to maybe explore. Yeah.
Well, and when you mentioned the lending side of it, I think that's something we got to think about too, because the woman, first-time home buyer that wanted to buy our 3D printed home, wanted to get a Virginia housing loan, and we work with 91 different lenders, and the lender she was working with wasn't going to give her a loan. Of course, we're the ones behind it, but wasn't going to give her a loan because 3D printed technology was so new. So we finally found a lender that we could work with, and she is in a home that's financed through a Virginia housing loan. But it's when it's something new, it's a little bit more difficult to bring everybody along with you. So it's a good point.
I would add really quickly, that is one great thing about Amazon, is that when we see an innovative opportunity, the company wants to jump at it, because Amazon prides itself on innovation and finding scalable ideas. For example, we just had a number of conversations about office space conversion, and we're very interested in it because it's, besides an opportunity for an existing building to be transformed, it's going to create a lot of 3 and 4 bedroom opportunities that are hard to get financed because the floor plan is already there. There's no way to do studios and 1 bedrooms in an existing office space. So what we see as a great opportunity to provide 3 and 4 bedroom at a lower cost to reach lower AMI population. So that's a great example of an innovation that Amazon is looking into now. We hope to be able to do some of those projects soon.
And I think Amazon's money could be very useful for priming the pipeline for the modular designs, because through LISC in LA, we took some innovation money from another source, from the city actually, and then that was doing the bridge to get the modular units started, and then the construction lenders came later.
Yeah, we've definitely seen a role where we're able to provide that sort of first step to get more traditional lenders comfortable with different structures and products. So that's been one of the great opportunities of being in Amazon and being able to see these things where we're able to sort of draw people in because we are able to put capital in, and they build some trust that we can continue to provide capital and keep working with people. So it's been a very big positive of my experience at Amazon.
Great. Time for one question, maybe, depending on how long the answer is, or maybe 2. Anybody? Yes, Ron?
It seems to me that one of the areas we can improve is if more corporations got involved and felt some responsibility for housing their employees. I don't see it very often. I hear about a few tech companies out on the West Coast that are desperate because California is so incredibly expensive. Arlington's other ways pretty expensive. I don't know why Amazon got in this space, got in is because you felt a sense of responsibility as you moved into a new headquarters to help with affordable housing. Is there anything beyond that? How does it affect your financial statement, for example, being involved in this space? What could other companies learn? What could we teach them to motivate them to get involved?
That's an excellent question. And obviously, the financial statement is something that I will have to see what happens sort of down the road as the program continues to get established. We're only in year 2 right now of a 5-year commitment, but hopefully we'll go well beyond that. Amazon absolutely got involved because it believes it's important to be a good citizen in these communities. And very much so that we saw the lack of affordable housing meant the inability to bring in good employees. If there was a gap anywhere, starts to put pressure on the rest of the system. So if there's no 30% AMI, if there's no 50% AMI, as you bring in people who are more expensive, like it just creates more pressure, and it makes it less desirable to live here. It may not be Amazon employees who are affected, but the people who teach their children, the police, the firefighters, the people who depend on that housing have to move farther out. It just makes things harder and harder. So part of our commitment was one that, again, we very much believe that affordable housing is a right and we want to be part of that solution. But 2, that in the long run, it will benefit the caliber and quality of the employees we're able to attract. And hopefully, through the stories of the Housing Equity Fund over time, other corporations will see what Amazon's benefit has been and enact their own efforts, because in the long term, it will benefit them. And you're right, I think almost all the tech firms have made at least some level of commitment to affordable housing in and around their headquarters. Microsoft has done quite a few buildings in the Seattle region. Google and Facebook have both made commitments. And so hopefully they'll continue to see that benefit, that it doesn't maybe necessarily fall to the financial statement right away, but in the long term, you're bringing in better people, you're bringing in more enthused employees who are more excited to live where you are in business. And so hopefully that will be what the benefit is long term.
So one very simple and effective thing that Amazon did that I'm very grateful for is, as Bobby said, I've been here for a long time and trying to beat that drum about economic development and housing. For the first time ever, as the state was trying to woo Amazon to Virginia, to the national landing, Amazon said, so where are you putting in money to address the housing issues? And that was huge because Virginia Housing did put $75 million of our own money into housing in this national landing area. And what we need, to your question, Ron, is we need to have now more employers, when they're coming in, say, if we're going to bring our jobs, where is the housing? Not only for their own employees, but for the teachers that teach their kids and police and anybody else. So I think that's a simple way to get to this, is more employers need to just be mindful of the criticality of affordable housing. And thank you, Amazon, for doing that.
On that note, that concludes. Thank you, panelists, for serving. And thank everyone for attending. And I think we're about to go to the grand opening.